As promised in the previous episode, I'm going to recap the moon landings. So, if you're a fan of the essays of our normal show on MK Ultra Radio, you'll undoubtedly have heard the episode on the moon. This is going to be almost an exact duplicate with a little bit of update, but since Deep Thoughts are brand new, thought I'd go ahead and redo it here. Because I'm saying all the time how we didn't go to the moon through all the episodes, and you're going, who is this guy? So first, let's start off with, does it matter? Well, probably not in the long run. If we have in the past, right? It's important we go back, or we go for the first time. As Buzz Aldrin said on live news, once we figure out how to go to the moon, it'll be a lot easier to get to Mars. Look that little quote up. You can just see him on TV saying it, and they go, what do you mean? And of course, his little camp said, he was confused, he was tired, and he said the wrong thing. And it's like, what other place could he have been talking about? Once we go to this other place, it'll be easier to get to Mars. No, Buzz Aldrin said it on live television. Once we figure out how to go to the moon, we'll have a lot better chance of getting to Mars. Should be one little smoking gun for your brain. He's the guy that went to the moon on the first mission, Apollo 11, with his buddy Neil Armstrong, right? Let me just say that I grew up a space kid. I grew up a space kid on crack. Every science fiction film, every sci-fi fantasy film, I was raised on that stuff. I used to draw the Saturn V rockets. I used to build little rockets that you would blow up, shoot into the sky. I had the cutaway space shuttle poster, studied every single mission. I've seen the Challenger grow up with Sally Ride. I've seen, I think the Challenger land in the California desert. I got nerdy accolades as a kid for knowing all these different missions, the Gemini missions, the Viking missions, the build-up to the mission to the moon. And as a child, I was told they're up there right now, when I was a real little kid. It's one of my first real cognitive memories is sitting in a crib outside my great-grandmother's home outside, and my mom pointing up at the moon and going, there's men up there right now. It's cool. It had to have been like second or third mission, if not the last couple in 72, because I was not quite born yet before the first mission took place. So the moon mission's a really weird one because people have a problem more with the moon landing not being real than 9/11 being an inside job. And I think that's fascinating. And there's one key reason why they have a problem with it. And that is because every man usurps the accomplishment for their own DNA. And they say, man did that. Mankind did that. Therefore, I am man. Therefore, I am as great as those people. And we are great. Boom. And honestly, there's a lot of benefit to having that opinion about yourself. And the moon mission's real or false or faked. Inspired me to get into science. A bunch of other people to get into science. And so it's had a profoundly positive effect, even if we did admit it was fake. But we're going to get into all science and get into one experience I had, which I'm just going to move right into, which is essentially being debriefed by someone from NASA who worked on the Mars mission, sitting next to his buddy who also worked on the Mars mission, who said essentially we didn't go. And it came out, and I've said the story 3 to 4 times on the show, so I apologize if this is a repeat. But for those of you who are just finding this show, it goes something like this. I'm at a trade show in Emeryville, California, 1981. We have set up our computers in the main room, but we can't turn them on. We can't plug them in because a union guy's got to come by and do it at $65 an hour. So we're taking a break, eating lunch, and I made the stupid joke, if you think if we could go to the moon, put a man on the moon, we could plug our own computers in the ground. Not knowing that the 2 guys in front of me had just left NASA. The guy directly in front of me had left a year before the guy to his left, to my right. And he looked at me and he goes, oh, you think we did? And I'm like, what? Like, I'm thinking about the computers being plugged in. I really wasn't obsessing on my moon question, right? And he said, you think we did? And I go, did what? He goes, go to the moon? I'm like, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I think that? dude, the internet doesn't exist yet. Of course I'm going to think that, right? So he looks to his buddy and he says, what do you think, man? And he wants to make sure his buddy's okay with the conversation he's about to have. And his buddy starts literally looking over his shoulder. And he said, well, if we did, I certainly couldn't find any techniques of how we did it. And then the big guy starts talking. And essentially says that, one, I found out about this guy later. He's a prodigy child. He graduated from high school at 16, started working for NASA in high school, immediately went to college and worked at NASA at the same time. He had several patents within NASA. I mean, the guy's a genius. And so I'm looking at a guy who's extremely astute. And he was at the top of the game of the company I worked with, right? And he essentially tells me that they looked and they looked and they looked. And then they were told that they didn't go. And they can keep looking their whole life, but that it's not going to reveal anything. And they essentially, he said that they were told, look, you can keep working in the Mars project and just shut your mouth and get a big fat paycheck. Mars mission will never happen in your lifetime, so you won't have any issues unless, of course, they pull a hoax, right? Sorry, there's a tiny thread of rain. It just rained earlier today. It's like 96 degrees out, and it just rained in California, which rain doesn't happen often in California. They eventually start talking about the science of it all, because I'm still confused. Telling me it's a hoax without any evidence is nothing to my brain, right? But they finally started talking about the fact that the radiation in space is the reason why they can't go up there. Nothing about the booster rockets not really being strong enough to pull it off, which is another piece of evidence that we know. But he said, look, the ambient radiation from the sun, minus a flare, is extremely deadly to mankind. And they said that before they left, the solution to the problem was to encircle a capsule in 6 inches of water, and that would just barely keep a human healthy for a mission into space for a very short duration. Not a Mars mission for a couple of years, right? But that doesn't protect them against flares. Certainly not against space debris flying around. I don't mean satellite debris, I mean rocks and stuff, which is insanely powerful, right? And so one in one ear and out the other. 1991, I didn't pay attention to anything. And then in 2001, a guy named Bart Siebel made a movie, and people don't like Bart. He's, he's sort of an odd fellow. But he put in a request to NASA saying, give me all of your photographs and videos of Apollo 11, because I'm making a documentary about the mission to the moon. And he didn't say he was doing a hit piece. He said he was doing a documentary. Or really didn't, tell him. And so they sent him a bunch of stuff, but somebody leaked out a piece of footage. Now, it could have been a mistake, or it could have been a leak. But in that video, you see them faking footage to the moon, or essentially faking footage of Earth going away from the capsule. And we'll get into all those details. Now, what I find interesting is the people that say that that we did go to the moon, and they're very angry when you ever bring it up, are people with very little knowledge in science, very little knowledge in the way the universe works, the way the bowels of the Earth work. They don't know about the Van Allen belts. They don't know about ambient radiation in space. They don't know the characteristics of the moon, how big it is. They don't know its 1/6 gravity properties. They don't know anything about it. But they're angry that you're making them have this thought, and so they get very upset. And at one point, the body does get to a point where you get frustrated that everything that you thought was one way is not that way, in at least a big part of the history, right? And so they just start getting pissed at you because you're like, God damn it, Lee Harvey Oswald was the first, and then it was 9/11, Oklahoma bombing, yada, yada. And now you're saying the moon, everything that you think is not the way it is, and it's like... Sorry. It's not. Truth is the truth, whether or not you want to believe it or not. That's the rub, But Siebel did something phenomenally brilliant. He did a beautiful job on this documentary, which you can find online. It's called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. I believe you can watch it all the way through. And then he, a few years later, made another movie called Astronauts Gone Wild, which I've said on the past is a very dumb name for a really cool idea. And he went and interviewed all of the astronauts he could get his hands on, and they all had different stories, and they didn't know the science of their journey. Some of them kicked them out of their house. I think one of the guys actually kicked him in the ass. Kicked his ass. You know? And then his grandson, when he's running out to his car, his grandson says really loud, "Should we call the CIA now?" As if the kid knows too. Now, I don't like that movie, and I love the movie. I don't like it because he accused the astronauts of creating the hoax themselves, right? And that's just not fair. They're just pilots who were threatened. They got a lot of accolades, and yes, they've made a lot of money off of it afterwards, but what else are they supposed to do? I guarantee you, lying to the American public and the world public about going to the moon, the attrition on the soul of a good person, maybe gets counterbalanced by 40, 50 years of accolades afterwards and money from books and that kind of stuff. It wasn't their idea. Now, what is not clear is whether or not the whole thing was going to be a hoax from the very beginning. I don't think anybody knows that besides the people involved. But I know what you're thinking. You're immediately thinking, dude, this can't be a conspiracy because there was hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved with this mission. And there's no way they could have all kept it quiet. And just like all of these 9/11 things, there's only a few people involved at the top. And everyone else is being duped as well within NASA. So let's get to how they faked the moon mission, and then we'll go back and talk about some of the evidence that just confirms everything I'm about to tell you. Because I know you want the juice right away, right? Me too. So it's very simple how they faked the moon missions. A few months before the first missions of the Apollo sequence went by, they launched a satellite into space that went around the Earth, real low orbit, and it was beaming down to the Earth telemetry data that's just staged. It's fake. It's just in a computer, and it's just playing a script. It's literally going to the next digit in memory and beaming that down to the ground. Next digit memory, beaming down to the ground. And it's on a time cycle to simulate what it would have been like had the Apollo 11 mission been in motion. So they could test run the whole thing, right? So that's already in orbit, and they can talk to it, and they can program it from ground. So they tell that satellite to refresh its program, give it new data that's just a little fuzzier than the previous data, right? So it wouldn't be exactly the same. They build the Saturn V rocket, which you're very familiar with, especially if you watched MTV in the 80s. They launch this thing into space, and all it can do with its boosters scientifically is with the gravitational pull of Earth and the boosters that are on this rocket, only thing it can do is achieve low orbit, around 200 miles up. That's all it can do. Apollo 10 was under 200 miles. Okay, give you a perspective. And I'm going to give you an analogy you can give to your friends, which will blow your fucking mind and blow everyone's mind and make it painfully evident that we didn't go. But I'll say that after this recap of how they did it. So you have this capsule in space, right? Or some type of object in space with these guys in it, as far as we know. Now, the conspiracy could be that nothing was actually in the capsule, that the astronauts walked into a chamber and then were smuggled out of the bottom of this thing and they never went to the actual location. That's possible too. But we see photographs of them in a capsule taking pictures of Earth through a portal window, which is part of the hoax. So I think that they went up there. But they're just in low orbit. That's all they're doing, low orbit. But meanwhile, the satellite's beaming down their journey. So all these ground radar centers that said, oh, we saw the Apollo capsule go to the moon. We tracked all of its telemetry. So did the Russians. The only thing they tracked was this fake satellite, was a satellite beaming down fake data. The capsule itself, which is invisible to the eye, you can't see it up there, right? People are like, you can see it with the naked eye. No, you can't. You can't. And if you could, they just blame it on some other satellite, right? Anyway, this thing's in low orbit, and they sit up there for the entire duration of their trip, talking down to the ground everything that matches the script that's being played on television. And I know what you're thinking. Well, what about the landing on the moon? That whole part, we saw videos of all that. Well, all those videos were completely created and finished before they actually launched this rocket. It's part of the game. Make sure you got what you need. Actors on the ground in a warehouse with a black ceiling and black walls with a fake moon surface, right? With actors inside these suits that do not have don't have like environmental systems in them. They're sweating their balls off on inside these suits. The whole set is chilled way, way down so that the suits actually keep them balanced and warm, so they get into hypothermia. They have fans blowing like crazy on these guys to keep them nice and Cool. And they are on wires, one wire that's perpendicular with their body, just like all the sets that they have for plays that they had done for 150 years before the moon missions were ever rumored to have happened. There's no stars in space, so that the black wire blends perfectly with the black back of the wall. They never ever take a photograph or a video of something going on the moon and then point it at the Earth, because that would have been too much geometry to figure out. So that footage never existed. In 6 missions, they never landed on the moon, took a video camera of a bunch of guys messing around, and then pointed it at the Earth in one continuous shot. It's one of their smoking gun that we never went. It would have been the first damn thing you would film, right? Look, Mom, no hands, right? Now they also couldn't do the stars for 2 reasons. One, part of the scam is to have black wires that, when filmed far enough away, even though they're blocking, some of the moon terrain, right, it still blends together. The light bends around the wire and gets into the lens, and you won't see it. The other one is that it blends in with the wall in the background, right? Oldest trick in the book. I saw David Copperfield flying around staging the Cupertino Flint Center once, and that was his game. Black curtain in the background, little sparklies all over the place, and he's on wires jumping around. The whole thing is choreographed beautifully. Whatever's happening on this moon set, Neil Armstrong or Buzz or Michael Collins are responding back and forth and playing these individuals. You can't see their faces because of the theory of this gold-plated shield, which was necessary to block the sun's light, because there's no atmosphere helping to diffuse the light into a blue sky. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true, that would need to be. But it also blocked the face of the individuals, so you couldn't see who was in the suits. Very important. So when the whole thing needed to end, they simply dropped the capsule back down, pick them up in the ocean, press conference, you're done. So let's get into some of the details. But that's how they faked it. There's something called the Van Allen belts. The Earth has most likely an electrical plasma interior. And when you have one of those gigantic balls of electricity, like the sun has, you get this giant belt around that object that provides an electrical field. Whole thing's made out of electrons, right, going in this beautiful circle, right? And it protects us against all the emissions from the sun, which is why never in the history of civilized man have we had one half of the Earth fry due to these coronal mass ejections. But today there's people fucking obsessed on this, as if science has changed somehow, as if the nature of the world changes. And they're building up in your psyche over time with this sort of psyop that the Earth is going to suffer some major cataclysm due to coronal mass ejection. It's all bullshit. You need to stop believing this crap. Earth is completely perfectly balanced. If the atmosphere ever has a problem, it's because the sun exploded or they have messed with it using HAARP and other stuff, punched holes in it so the stuff comes through. But it's not just the low atmosphere, right? It's way out there in space. It's about 25,000 miles thick, and it doesn't start till about 1,000 miles up. So if our astronauts had gone through this thing in an aluminum capsule that's 1/4 inch thick, just the sheer physics and science that we can do on paper proves that they would have been fried like eggs. They would have been absolutely carbonized human beings. The whole capsule probably would have vaporized because it's gonna resonate the frequency inside the capsule. And for the same exact reason they don't want you to put metal in a microwave is the exact same reason why they couldn't put astronauts inside this thing. Because when you put metal in a microwave, what happens is the waves bounce off the metal. And when that happens, whatever frequency was dialed in perfectly to boil your water is now 4, 5, 10x, and it's going to start frying the microwave itself. This is not supposed to have that much thermal energy and friction inside, right? Same thing with this capsule. Now, interestingly enough, a couple physicists have done tests on what this capsule-shaped thing would look like coming back into orbit. And he said it's completely ridiculous that it would ever come in stable, that it would have to be almost inverted upside down like a bullet head coming in to actually take the atmosphere and wrap it around it in a way that it wouldn't wobble itself to death and kill the astronauts. It's very interesting. It seems to make sense. And they use computer simulation software to actually simulate the turbulence of the atmosphere, the thickness of oxygen as it increases over time, and moving this object at, 15,000 miles an hour to 35,000 miles an hour, right? So the number one reason why we can't get there is that we don't have a capsule that actually can insulate the human flesh from this incredible magnetic field out there. And that's what the Orion project at NASA right now is trying to do, is to develop a capsule that can go through the Van Allen belts without killing everybody inside. They've already shot up one mission without anybody in it, when, as far as I know, I haven't heard any of the results from it. Certainly didn't hit national news. But when they announced the Orion mission, they announced that we didn't go to the moon immediately, because the problem they're trying to solve was solved 7 times. 8 times if you count Apollo 10 that went up. Apollo 10 went up and just circled the moon and came back. It was the big test, right, supposedly, right? They perfected all their techniques on 10. 10 didn't go up more than 200 miles, right? Let's do a quick analogy. I want you to think about this particular analogy as you listen to everything else I have to say, because I don't want to save it to the end, because then you might drop off. Most of you are sitting in a home watching this, or someplace, and you have a room with generally an 8-foot ceiling, right? From the bottom of your floor to the ceiling in your house, it's 8 feet. I don't know what is a metric. I apologize. But if you were to take that distance and divide it 237 times, why 237? Well, it's because it's a room in The Shining that Kubrick made, and it happens to be the average distance in thousands of miles from us to the moon. So the moon is in a weird orbit. It's 237,000 miles away from Earth on any one average day. Okay. So when you take that 8-foot roof and you divide it down, if you're just to notch it all the way down, right, you would have notches that are a little under half an inch, probably around a centimeter, to be honest. And each centimeter would represent 1,000 miles up in the sky towards the moon. So at the bottom of your floor is Earth's surface, and at the ceiling edge is the moon. And every centimeter is 1,000 miles, right? All right. Now, way down at the bottom of your floor, the first top of the first centimeter is where the Van Allen belts start. And then 25 centimeters up from that point is where you can write another darker line, and that's where the Van Allen belts exist. Okay? Huge distance to travel through, because remember, these guys are supposed to be doing this slingshotty thing. So they're not traveling straight through it. They're traveling in it constantly until they slingshot to the moon, which I think is just a bunch of horse shit. But anyway, now, prior to going to the moon, the highest distance we had ever been in space, according to all the official records. And again, I understand that a lot of you don't believe anything that NASA says, and I commend you for that. And I'm just going to say to you, I'm going to use a little bit more of their official measurements and official information to fight this claim. So what I'm saying may or may not have occurred, but the stuff that's in Wikipedia is good enough to kill the moon mission just by sheer theory, okay? But the highest we had been before we had circled the moon once was 197 miles up in the sky. So take one of your centimeters and now divide that into tens, into 10 little notches. Take 2 of the notches in the centimeter. Okay, it's going to be 20% of your centimeter, which is a couple millimeters, right? And that's as high up as man had ever been prior to making it all the way to the ceiling. So now if you just sit back and let that sink in for a second, let that sink in. Just try to imagine 2 millimeters when you look at the floor to your ceiling. 2 millimeters, way the fuck down there on the ground. And supposedly, without any mistakes whatsoever, any life-threatening events, and spare me Apollo 13's thing. Apollo 13, which is a complete fucking lie. It was just a big drama queen thing to get you back into being interested in the moon back in the day, right? Most of us weren't alive when this stuff was, or cognizant when this stuff happened. But if you're older, then that's what that was all about. But you should realize right away that magnitude of traveling the rest of the distance to the ceiling was way, way beyond our technical capabilities. And to then add 2 just getting there, that's one horrendous thing that we didn't have the ability to do. But just add on top of that all the logistics of approaching the moon, separating the lunar lander from the capsule, and then going down and landing and hopping out and messing around and getting back in and launching back up and re-rendezvousing with the capsule and getting rid of the lunar module top and then flying back. unbelievably complex. I mean, it's a brilliant idea. It's a brilliant set of a brilliant story about how they could have done it and how they might end up doing it in the end. But right now, it's ridiculous, especially 1969. NASA was behind the Russians in every single way imaginable for the space race. Right, Russians the first satellite in space, first animal in space, first dog in space, or first human in space, first dual human in space, first woman in space, first double mission in space. They had better boosters than us, and they couldn't make it. They couldn't even conceive of making it, right? Now, some people say that was all, like they said in the movie Interstellar, and I think that they're trying to actually prep us for the truth because of the weird line in the movie Interstellar where Matthew McConaughey goes to his daughter's school, and his daughter's in trouble because she says that we went to the moon, and the school literally looks him in the face and says, well, we didn't go to the moon. We faked it to beat the Russians in the Cold War. Well, there's a lot of truth to that, too. It really did punch him in the pants, right? When we said we went, it was like, oh, well, gosh, I guess there's no other place to go, you know. Let's back up to Wernher von Braun, the dude who led the mission. I've said it several times. Wernher von Braun, he designs the V1 and V2 rockets. It's used to slaughter people wholesale in Europe and especially in England. You know, England today has neighborhoods where they had track houses, and there's houses missing because V1 and V2 rockets blew the living shit out of them. For some reason, they didn't rebuild. That's probably changing over time, but, you know, one of my good friends who lives over there, he says, you know, place I live still has places missing, right? So Wernher von Braun is smuggled into the United States using Operation Paperclip. Most of you know this, right? Again, half of them became the CIA and made the MK Ultra program that this thing is named after, right? I'm Mark, Kyle, MK. Hope that all makes sense. He goes to the White House and says, I got a mission to Mars idea. This is how the story is romanticized. Who knows if he really did it, but he wrote a bunch of papers on it. And they said, you know, we've seen the designs of the rocket you want to build, which is bigger than the Empire State Building, and so we're thinking maybe you should try for the moon. He said, well, it doesn't matter. We have to leave Earth's gravitational pull, which means we have to move whatever object we're talking about 11 miles per second to pull it off, to actually leave orbit, not just be in orbit, right? He says, I got to build this rocket. It's going to be fucking huge. Our boosters suck, and we're going to have to build a bunch of them underneath this rocket to make it happen. I believe that he wrote that document in 56 and he recertified it in 65. I think those are the proper dates. Plus or minus 1 year on the second date. But they said, you know, let's do the moon first and then we can go to Mars. And that sounds logistically cool, right? I mean, like, of course, let's do this simple one first. And the idea that right now we're going to be going to Mars next and not going back to the moon is proof we never went to the moon. So one thing that isn't clear is whether or not von Braun actually meant what he said or whether or not he was just theorizing it. So one thing that isn't clear is whether or not they meant to go for real or whether or not the whole thing was set up as a hoax. If Wernher von Braun was let go from NASA 2 years after the last mission in 72, and he dies in the late 70s. Being let go from NASA for me is sort of another smoking gun that something he committed to didn't get delivered. And it's not that he can't retire from the organization. It's just really odd that they wouldn't just leave him on as like an alumni fellow or whatever. But consequently, right after the first moon mission in 69, the head of NASA also quit within a month. Very bizarre to preside over man's greatest accomplishment and then leave the organization as they have several missions planned after that, right? But I think the guy wanted to get the hell out of town. So what I have done is I've gone back and I've researched all the players that have been theorized as to being part of this thing, and I've strung together some interesting connections. So I'm just going to give you how I see individuals working together, okay? Now, if you're going to fake a moon mission, you've got a couple of responsibilities right away. You're going to have to build something realistic in the outside world, like a Saturn V rocket, and you're going to have to make it launch into the sky, get out of people's view. It needs to be physically foreboding. You know, it needs to be something that's like so massive and so big that you believe that thing can make it to the moon. So there's a shock and awe factor to the reality part of the game, right? The second thing is if you're going to fake all this moon mission stuff, you're going to need a technique. You need a technique to show the Earth getting smaller, moon surface landing, and if you want to bring back space rocks, you're going to have to figure out a way to do it. It's believable, right? In comes Stanley Kubrick. Now, the association with Stanley Kubrick needs to be qualified because I've never met the man. He passed away, unfortunately, early in life, 70 years old, right after making Eyes Wide Shut. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And God knows what imagery systems he was going to hide in AI, But that was cleaned up by Spielberg and released soon after his death, right? But a guy named Arthur C. Clarke, who was a NASA scientist who pretty much theorized geocentric orbits, was also a science fiction writer on the side, and he approaches Kubrick. Now, Kubrick, as I wanted to say, was that I think Kubrick is a man of ultra integrity at his core, and I think that I'm going to suggest that he was involved in this, but I'm not going to suggest for a second that he was happy about it. He just doesn't give me that vibe. And because he left the United States of America right after the moon missions and said, I want away from this fucking country. In so many words, you can read various paraphrases of what he said about leaving America without any explanation. He didn't say it was Vietnam War or anything. He just said, I just don't want to be by this place anymore. And he moves to England and with his wife and his kids and films most of his films over there until he's forced to shoot something in the United States. Arthur C. Clarke came to Kubrick and he said, I'm thinking about doing a mini-series on television, and I'd like you to direct it. It's all going to be science fiction. I think I can find the budgets for it and this kind of stuff, which is fucking ridiculous that this guy would have any connection with Hollywood. I've seen the most amazing, brilliant people be unable to sway Hollywood, and they've got juice, and they got money, and the capability. Arthur was nobody. Trust me, absolutely nobody. But Kubrick said, I don't want to do television, I only do film. And so they quickly renegotiated the whole idea that Arthur had an idea for a book, which is 2001: A Space Odyssey, but he didn't quite have it named, didn't quite have it figured out. He says, I'll finish this book. I'll take the series and I'll put it into one film, and then you can film the film. And then they went off and got a $15 million budget for their movie that didn't have a script, that didn't have a finished story, and it got approved. Now, for any of you who know anything about Hollywood, go try to fucking do that. Get the biggest allocation of money in the history of Hollywood to make a movie without a script. People don't take risks like that in Hollywood unless it's something that needs to occur. At that point, I think Stanley was just figuring, I lucked out. I got a really great opportunity to make a science fiction film. He's making other movies at the same time, Dr. Strangelove and those kind of things. But eventually he gets very, very committed to this new project, and they start making one of the most landmark science fiction films in the history of the world. All to create props and mechanisms and know-how and camera knowledge to fake these moon missions. Now, there was a little interview with Kubrick's wife, which reveals a lot of what I'm about to tell you, and I've seen her mouth move and the words come out of her mouth for the following information. When Stanley got done filming the first act of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where they find the monolith on the moon, they built a little moon surface. And it looks nothing like anything in the moon landings as far as I could tell between the two. So it's not something that was actually used most likely for the moon missions, but it was some place to practice, right? And the movie came out in 1968, but movies take several years to make, and Kubrick movies take even longer to make, right? But Henry Kissinger went down and, according to Kubrick's wife, and rented the set for a couple weeks just to do some shots. Now that right there is kind of a smoking gun. Why would a architect of foreign policy come in to shoot a moon base? Was it he's just having fun? I've always thought about being a director. No, he was prepping footage for the moon, trying to figure out how to do it. Now, Kubrick had a policy with 2001, which was extremely regimented. He said, I don't want anyone using my props for their films. So every time we finish with the prop, and we got everything in the can, we got all the coverage we need, I'm going to destroy the prop. So the Odyssey spaceship was destroyed, any monolith was destroyed, sets were completely liquidated, so it would never show up anywhere else. And so he wanted Kissinger off his set. And according to his wife, Kubrick's wife, he said, I'm going to go down and help him get these shots because I'm sick and tired of them roaming around my set, and they just aren't getting anywhere. And that's the last we heard about it from Kubrick himself participating in these shots. Okay, Kubrick would have been the best director in the world to fake the moon missions because he's a serious guy, and he had an eye that was unlike anyone else's eye in the film business, right? So now we're going to jump around his thing. Because later on, when Kubrick passed away, the story goes from his wife that they were digging out his old paperwork in his office, and they found an envelope which had a letter in it from the White House marked top secret, or some type of clearance like that, basically saying, for your service to your country, we're going to give you this lens from NASA, and we're more than happy to give this to you because of your service to your country. And he was borrowing a lens from NASA to film the movie Barry Lyndon. Barry Lyndon was a period piece set way back before electricity, and so all of the sets were lit by candle, and what Kubrick wanted to do was keep it pure. And he knew about a top-secret lens that was developed by NASA, which is rumored to be valued at $3.5 million back in 1971. Can you imagine? The whole budget of 2001 is $15 million, and this one Zeiss lens is worth $3.5 million, right? So he gets the lens shipped to him, he uses it, and Barry Lyndon has to ship it back. So how do you know something exists unless you know it exists, right? And especially if it's top secret and an asset of NASA. It wasn't like they released an article on the lens and he just simply asked for it. The letter was top secret. Now, there's a lot of you who probably want me to mention The Shining because I just gave a little homage to it. I think it's fairly conclusive that the movie The Shining, which again, I think Stephen King completely misunderstood what Kubrick was doing, but he used the movie brilliantly to signify that he was a part of the moon missions and that being a part of the moon missions was a terrifying experience for him, and that he probably lost at least a close friend as a result of maybe sharing something on accident or someone finding out about it. But there's a scene in the middle of The Shining, aside from all the Indian art on the wall, the Native American art being rockets. I think that's pretty fascinating. Growing up in the Midwest surrounded by Native American stuff, I never saw that before, so it's fabricated art. But there's a scene in the center of the film when Danny, the little boy, is playing with his Hot Wheels on this hexagonal, custom-created carpet, and hexagons are the shape of NASA launch pads, right? The kid's playing with his toys, and a little tennis ball rolls up, and he's already been warned about this room 237 by the Halloran character. I think it's Scatman Crothers, right? He was 88 years old when the film was made. Guy looks like he's 60. And the little boy stands up. The Danny character stands up, and he's got a custom knit sweater that says Apollo 11 on it, or at least Apollo on it, right? And he's got a rocket on his chest. And so he's launching from the launch pad, image-wise, and he is traveling to room 237. And there's the whole thing about in the book, it's 217, and Kubrick changed it up 20 digits to make it 237. And they asked Kubrick why he changed the number, and he said, well, there's a real room, 217, in that hotel, and I wanted to move it outside of the range of actual rooms so there wouldn't be any spooky economic consequence to the hotel. Now, the hotel's up in Portland, Oregon. Most of us thought it was in Denver, Colorado somewhere, but it's not. And there's a 237 room in there. It always has been. So that was a lie outright. But if you think about it, a rocket's traveling 237, and it goes inside this room, and a woman molests the kid and tears him up, and he's comatose for a long time after that. Something horrible happened in the room. Something horrible happened to Kubrick as a result of being involved with this. He hated this whole thing, right? And the last rumor comes out of the movie, Room 237, which is interesting. Room 237, the movie, is full of a bunch of bullshit about him doing Holocaust homages and stuff. It's pure Moon. It's pure Moon, trust me. Everything else is just the story he had to carry forward. But he also has the secret societies at the end with all these crazy fucking people dressed in outfits, right? So at the end of the film, I think it's Dick Halloran is the character that Scatman Crothers plays. He travels completely from Florida all the way to supposedly Colorado, which is, it's obviously Oregon. And he drives the snowcat all the way up to the hotel to try to save the kid, who sent him a psychic message, my dad's gone crazy, come save us. And as soon as he comes into the hotel, different than the book, he comes in the hotel and he's killed in, I think, less than 60 seconds with an axe to the chest. And someone's insinuated that maybe that was a friend of Kubrick being the boy that got killed as a result of this whole 237 thing. It's an interesting change in the script. It really doesn't, it doesn't make sense in the story, but it was a great scene. It freaked the shit out of you when you saw, Jack Nicholson's character come out of nowhere and slam him in the chest with an axe, right? So Kubrick has been involved, I think, against his will, and I think he left the country as a result of it. That's just my hunch based on all the stuff that I've seen and the admissions from his wife being combined with all that stuff, right? So when you get into Moon Hoax stuff, you want to always hear the evidence as to how we know we didn't go to the moon. Well, I can tell you one of the greatest things that's happened in the last 10 years of my life is that all my buddies in special effects have had the courage to look at the moon missions and the moon photographs, which are sort of the telltale sign that we didn't go. And it goes something like this. And I grew up with Hasselblad cameras my whole life. Hasselblad cameras were the cameras used on the moon. They interviewed the gentleman who made the actual Hasselblads for the moon missions, the actual individual that made them. And if you don't know anything about Hasselblads, they take about a year to make. That's how precise and amazing they are. And then they asked this guy, look, what would happen to your camera if it went to 250 degrees Fahrenheit and then negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit within a couple seconds? And he said, it would completely warp and blow up. I mean, it just would not be a functional camera. And he says, that's interesting, because that's what happened to the cameras that went to the moon if they made it, right? My dad was told that they actually made a special lubricant for the camera to withstand these heat changes. I've never found that confirmed anywhere, but maybe he's right. But the camera was essentially fixed to the chest of Neil Armstrong's chest. And Neil Armstrong took just shy of 30 photographs, and every single photograph's a Time Life cover. There's not a single bad photograph. And for those of us who have cameras on our telephones and we can, take as many photographs as we like at concerts and events, you'll know that that is impossible. I guess about 27 photographs, I think, was the number that he took. And every single one of them is framed perfectly. Everything's all set up. I mean, they're absolutely perfect. And the thing is that Neil could not look down through the viewfinder of the Hasselblad, because you stared straight down into a Hasselblad that then looks straight out, right? So the technicality of him shooting these photographs is impossible. It just is impossible, right? If I gave you a camera right now, Hasselblad, with 27 pictures in it, and I said, you can't look down into it, you got to fasten it to your chest, but you got to go to Disneyland and bring me back 27 great photographs, but you can keep going every day until you get it right. We're just reset it at the beginning of every day to 27 photographs. You'd be going for a decade to get 27 perfect photographs. And this guy nailed it on the first try. Neil Armstrong is not a photographer, all right, so he didn't have any special capabilities to pull this off, but he did, supposedly, right? They trained him how to take great photos. Give me a break. Or he could send him to the Brooks Institute and get a PhD in photography, and he wouldn't be that good. All right? But the photos are phenomenal. And because we have 3D rendering software now, we now can take a shot. And because there's so many kids today who've created scenes for film, for television, for video games, they see light like you and I do not see light. They see light sources, hot spots. My friends do what's called pixel fucking. They work at Blizzard Entertainment, and they'll work on a trailer where they're working on 5 seconds for 6 months just to make sure every pixel in that shot is perfect, right? And they look at the moon footage and they go, oh my God, there's 5 light sources at least with what I'm seeing. Hot spots here, here, and here, and here, which means lights are behind the only light source that there is, which is the sun. And there's been all these theories that, the light bounces off the dust on the ground of the moon and backlights Buzz Aldrin climbing down from the lunar lander. Physics absolutely denies the lumen reflection claim that could be possible, right? So a lot of experts have weighed in on this. You also have a lot of light sourcing, which I try to stay away from the shadow theories. They're actually real theories where they have so many multiple light sources that the shadows are converging and not going off parallel like they should. Converging shadows means there's 2 light sources pushing a shadow towards each other, right? The other one is that when they took a picture of the lunar lander in Apollo 11 is where they made all the mistakes that they had to repeat through all the additional missions. And so it's actually extremely valuable to look at Apollo 11 mission footage. But because the lunar lander was actually craned down to a set and not actually landed with the 10,000 thrust pound engine on the bottom, most of you remember the shot out the window when the lunar lander supposedly landing, and they said the famous line, the eagle has landed, right? You see metric tons of dirt flying on this footage if it was real. But as soon as they got out of the lunar lander and took pictures of it, which are crystal clear Hasselblad photographs, you have no dust anywhere. So the feet, which are shiny, steel, like brass-covered tinfoil or something, right? Not a single speck of dirt on any of it, because that never occurred. In fact, there's a little parachute thing that's on the bottom, right underneath the main thruster engine. Not a single ounce of the dirt or the craters that was underneath this 10,000-pound thrust engine were moved at all. And consequently, they actually hired Norman Rockwell, the old painter that did all the crazy classical American paintings, to actually paint what it might look like if a 10,000 pound thrust engine, say that 100 times, were to actually, carve out a crater. And they were actually worried it was going to create a crater that then this thing would be so stuck in that the astronauts wouldn't be able to crawl out of it. But no such problem actually occurred. So some of you will say moon rocks. Well, moon rocks are complete proof that we win. Well, the way the moon rocks worked was that a bunch of astronauts are actually recorded. And sorry, I shouldn't say astronauts, but I think a couple astronauts actually did it. But a lot of scientists went down to South Pole, where all the ice is, and they picked up meteorites off the snow. This is recorded in history, and brought it back to NASA. And because any rock from another planet can be monitored for its radiation signature, we can tell whether or not it's part of Earth because it will have a signature unlike Earth. And so we can tell if a rock is from this planet or not from this planet. If you ever meet an alien, the big thing is to take something off of their person. If you bring back a ruler with crazy writing on it, we can just put it underneath this frequency checker, and we can say, yeah, this thing it's not from Earth. That doesn't mean that people can't craft things out of iron meteorites and still claim the same exact thing, because that happens as well. The Egyptians used to walk out in the desert and find iron ore meteorites and build all their bombing tools out of it. So there's embalming tools that actually have different signatures from Earth's signature, but simply because that's where it was already refined, in nature. So the moon rocks are fake. As a fact, I think, what was it, Neil Armstrong or Buzz gave one of the Russian diplomats a rock from the moon, which was later revealed to be petrified wood, which is hilarious, right? Petrified wood is so obviously not a rock. I mean, it is rock minerals, but it's been crafted through petrifying, actual replacing molecules in biological matter called wood. And NASA never replied as to the hoax, right? So somebody could blow that off and say, they just wanted to fuck the guy over and give him something stupid. But these rocks have now, I believe, been lost, which is kind of funny. You were never allowed to touch them. They were in these hermetically sealed things, and there was rumors that they would explode if they ever felt the pressure of Earth or the lack of pressure. I mean, it's just bizarre rumors why you could never get close to these rocks because it was a big sore spot in their mission, right? So the other evidence I mentioned was the Bart Siebel getting this videotape of them faking footage traveling away from Earth. And the way they did it was actually fairly brilliant and fairly simple. If any of you remember All the Right Stuff, this episodic thing that was on HBO in the mid 80s, there was this big romanticized history that Neil Armstrong demanded that the capsule had a portal window as if they were going to put a window in the thing, right? And it was going to be this huge engineering effort to put the portal window in there. Well, the portal window was one of the mechanisms to create this fantasy that we went to the moon. And what they did was it was a fisheye lens, right? So if you looked at the lens that went in the side of this capsule, it was very thick and very bowed to be like a fisheye lens. So take a larger object and compress it into a smaller image. The goal of it was to take most of the visible Earth and compress it into this circle so it would look like Earth when you filmed it across the capsule, which is just a few feet, right? But with a wide-angle lens, it can be controlled to look as big as or small as you want. And when they filmed the window, it was all of Earth in this circle. And so you could simply move the camera close to make a close-looking shot and farther away to make a farther away shot. Well, they also had the dilemma of daytime horizons, where the sun is on the other side, and it's covering up the sun. So they started holding up a gel to the window to create this fake curve. This footage goes on for 54 minutes, and inside the capsule you can see, at times, arms in front of the window. And Neil Armstrong, on camera, or at least on a recording, said, I've pushed the camera all the way against the glass of this portal window, so everything that you see is dark is supposed to be space, not supposed to be the inside of the capsule. Well, it's obviously a lie when you have arms going between the camera and the actual window. But the telltale sign is in the last 60 seconds of this, Michael Collins is the one holding the camera. They're finished with this hoax, and they filmed the whole thing chronologically backwards. They filmed the faraway pictures of Earth first, all stamped by atomic clock, and as they perfected the shot, they moved the camera closer to the window, getting the bigger shots of the Earth, which would mean they were closer to Earth, which is exactly the opposite of the direction they're headed at the time that this was supposed to be occurring. Only 60 seconds was ever aired on television. But they turn the lights on inside the capsule. You see an arm pull the gel off the window. You see the light in the room, and Michael Collins takes the camera, points it at his face, and smiles. And consequently, the camera was fairly high res, and it was in color. But what does the footage look like when Neil Armstrong runs down the ladder and says he landed on the moon? Grainy and black and white. How did America get that footage? How did the world get that footage? Well, it was transmitted to NASA exclusively. No one was allowed to have the feed of where it came from, because you'd find out it was Earth to Earth broadcasting, right? But they filmed it, they broadcast it on a wall with paint on it, not on a screen. And then the networks were allowed to film the wall to basically create the grainiest footage possible to conceal any mistakes that they were potentially going to run into, right? Because, you think you got it all covered until someone starts analyzing it a decade later or 4 decades later, like we do today, right? So that was a bit of a cover-up as well. Now, the additional missions started getting more liberal. In the first Apollo 11 mission, they said that there was no way they could take an extra paper clip. The weight to booster ratio was very heavily controlled, and the very next mission they take up what Kyle likes to call the Chrysler, the moon buggy, which is 900 pounds. So all of a sudden, without improving the boosters to create a better show, a better theatrical moment on the moon, they bring this car with them. Now, there's a couple things missing with the car. One, they've never filmed where they started, how they brought it out, and assembling it, even if it just kind of folded out into place. They never filmed any of that. You'd think you would at some point. Secondly, the first photograph we have of this buggy is got the same problem as the lunar lander. The buggy was actually craned down to the ground and dropped off, so there was no tracks underneath the tires. So the very first photograph published about this thing was the front, I think, left quarter panel. You see the tire and no tracks, okay, and no footprints or anything. So the whole thing was craned down, and then, of course, they did drive it around. Interesting. Some of you have seen the weightless photograph, the footage, right, where they're jumping around on the moon. Well, once you roll that footage 2x, you literally take your QuickTime player and say, play this back at 2x. Everything's real time. Now, 1/6 gravity is not 2x speed, right? 1/6 gravity would be some weird ratio between what we experience and what they experience up there. But it's fake, and so that's how they faked it. A lot of you have seen the flag that they supposedly put up on the moon that's blowing in the wind. The reason why it's blowing in the wind is because there's massive air conditioners and fans blowing around constantly to keep these guys from heat exhaustion inside these outfits, right? Because at 1-to-1 gravity here on Earth, you couldn't have a 110-pound environmental system on your back because it would, make you fall over backwards, right? You'd have huge logistical problems. Every time an astronaut jumps around on the moon, the dust at their feet goes flying like 6 to 10 feet because the fans are hitting them really hard. One of the other things is I met a guy, very famous painter, at another famous painter's house. And he said that in college he built a machine that created faux moon surfaces. And it was basically a catapult that you put a rock in, and it would pick up different rocks, and it would throw in random directions these rocks, and it would puff inside sand that they had installed at this college, and it built overnight a moon surface. Well, in 1964, they came and bought it off of him and removed the installation from the college. And he said once he saw the moon footage, he goes, that was my machine. That was exactly my specific custom surface. Now, it doesn't account for the papier-mâché rocks that are also added to the set, right? I'm almost done with this sort of giving you some evidence stuff because most of you know about this stuff. But this is stuff you can look up on the web. It's fantastic, right? There is the papier-mâché rock with the C on it, and I almost buy NASA's explanation for that, which is a little hair that got in the negative and just happened to be a C. That makes more sense to me, but the rock has a fold in it like paper, so it doesn't geologically match anything that happens on Earth, right? And you could say it's the moon's problem, but come on. Looks like papier-mâché to me. But they did 2 missions where they actually reused the sets. And so you have the exact same mountainscape in the background, and all they did was lay down a bunch of rocks for the second use of the set to kind of dirty it up. And NASA's explanation is that these 2 missions were in the same direction, north, south, east, west, and that you're simply seeing the same mountains in the background. That only flies if you don't know how big the moon is. The moon is 1/10 the size of Earth. I live in Huntington Beach. I go to the beach. I look at the fact that very, very quickly out there in the ocean, it disappears, right? If a big cruise liner or cargo ship comes, I can see the top of it first, and I see the body come up, and then it crests the curvature of the Earth. Well, at 1/10 the ratio, the second mission would not have been able to see the mountains remotely. Maybe the tippy tops, but it would look entirely different than these two photographs, which are identical. So you have to keep that in mind too, right? Now, the other one that's sort of telltale is the older that you get is the press conference between Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, and Buzz Aldrin and the press, and that they just simply look like they've been crying for hours. They look very nervous, very worried. And people said, oh, it was post-moon stress. And I just want to throw in there, if you had successfully gone to the moon and come back and you get to live the rest of your life a superhero and you get to see your family and there's nothing wrong with you, there wouldn't be any reason to be depressed whatsoever. Right? These guys managed to do the impossible, but they're depressed because they think they're going to get caught. Neil Armstrong in his entire lifetime never took a videotaped interview of his event going to the moon because he's very religious. I think he's very moral, and he doesn't want to lie on camera. Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, well, Michael wrote a book and rediscovered a bunch of science that happened that he said didn't happen when he came back, and Buzz Aldrin has been living high on the hog. Again, I don't blame these guys for trying to salvage a bad situation. I don't blame them at all. And depending on how the hoax was pulled off and why it was pulled off, I really rescind a lot of blame out of the people that were involved trying to make it happen. Right? They were trying to save America's image and try to kill the Cold War, which seemed to be a definite byproduct of what happened there. Right? Now, I do believe that NASA is trying to figure it out on one level because of the Orion mission, but I think we're being set up for a major hoax, which is the Mars mission. So I want you to keep very steadfast with the fact that the moon's been faked. The logistical nature of the next mission is that we're not going to be reusing anything from NASA in 1969, so you wouldn't want to take brand new technology and push it to the very extent of going 2 years away from Earth, right? Of course, they say it got it down to 6 months now, right? You would test it on the moon for sure. The moon supposedly has minerals and things we can actually refine and bring back to Earth if we wanted to. If nothing else, set up a space base, right? But we're not doing that because we've never been there, and we don't want to get caught. So it's getting late. I'm losing my light because it's we got some clouds up ahead, up above here, and it's getting late. So I'm gonna for the very first time, I'm gonna actually pause this video. You're gonna probably see me change a shirt, and I'll look a little bit different in a few seconds here. I'm going to take this up in part 2 tomorrow, but you won't see it until it all comes out at once. So this is the end of segment 1, and now I'm going to do a magic trick. All right, here we go. See, we're back. Light's back. It's all good. All right, to continue on this moon thing, I want to take a quick pause and just basically acknowledge the way that we get information of this kind. Because I know what it's like. You're looking at this crazy show, Deep Thoughts. You're like, who's this punk on the video saying all the stuff about how we didn't go to the moon? I want to remind you that the number one reason why we believe in this is because we've usurped the accomplishment of man, like I said at the very beginning. And when you base a lot of your identity on something, it's very nerve-wracking and upsetting to have someone come around and say that that piece of your id, that piece of your consciousness is no longer true. And what that does is creates a void inside you that you need to refill with something else, some other point of pride. But just like a house of cards, let's just say, if you start pulling out the cards at the bottom, this thing's going to crumble. And I think it's a testament to the truthers that we're able to rearrange these cards and nothing tumbles. What we end up doing is we take out a card, but at the same time we're putting in the card of truth. And so we're able to revise history without taking a personal hit to our psyche. And for a lot of us, we actually like to have the truth put in place of the propaganda. And that's sort of the psychological difference once you sort of wake up and find out that the truth is better than the lie. And what is really interesting is that when you start speaking about the truth of the world and who runs the planet and, bankers that are getting our soldiers killed and that kind of stuff for their agendas, it comes off as a very negative thing at first. And, what's really weird about it is if you're in any other type of personal relationship or business relationship and someone's filling that relationship with lies, you tend to say, I don't want any lies, I want the truth. And in some cases, we will go ahead and buy the lie just to defend our ego, which is a little fragile. right? I think the ego is extremely fragile for most human beings. But and so they'll say to you, you know, well, how do you sleep at night? How do you sleep at night? And the whole thing is, I sleep perfectly fine because I prefer truth over a lie, you know? So I wanted to get into a little bit of the mechanics of why, or how the hoax is actually developed since 1972 when we did our last mission to the moon, quote unquote, right? The last hoax to the moon. The agencies that run the world need lots of money, and they need to be able to get the money from some sanctioned place and then make it theirs in a way that is untrackable. And so, you know, a lot of times they'll call it liquid cash, and it's usually money that needs to be laundered in some form or fashion. So that's one reason why our intelligence agents deal in drugs. You know, cocaine and heroin is the number one drug of the intelligence agents. They bring it into the world and they sell it. Now, what they realized they could do with that mechanism is as soon as they started dropping it, society started crumbling in those areas, right? And so they found out, we can repress people with this. And so they ended up dropping it in ghettos. And they could keep various races down the entire time and get them to fight over it. And, you know, literally you got black on black crime that's crazy, and it's usually driven by territorial disputes over the distribution of a drug. But none of these individuals in the ghettos have C-130s. You know, they don't have any relationships with cartels. And so the mind doesn't really put together, how do they get these drugs? How do they get them in kilos and pounds constantly, every single day, right? There's not enough buttholes to stuff, you know, balloons up in to account for what we have. There's not enough duffel bags being pushed out of little tiny 2-engine planes to account for all the drugs that are actually sold. And that's why the professors at Berkeley University did the math on how much the United States government says that we consume on a daily basis, and then they amortized that up over months and years and said, my God, we're talking about a fleet of planes filled to the brim with this drug to drop it off. And I mentioned that weird drug digression because NASA has become this place where they can launder a tremendous amount of money. The moon missions, as reported by Bart Siebel back in the day, ran about $9.5 billion. And you just, you know, you roll that up for today's money, and we're talking deep into the probably hundreds of billions, right? Okay. At the same time, you have this interesting technique where you can charge $500 for a toilet seat cover. That was the joke that constantly came out of the Pentagon in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that they would have these black projects. And so this you know, $10 toilet cover was being billed to the United States citizens as $500. So they launder off the top of that $490 that goes to a black project and pays for things that we don't know about, which eventually turn out to be SR-71s and stealth fighters and all kinds of stuff, stealth bombers and that kind of thing. Well, NASA became this interesting kind of dual project where they did want to conquer space, but at the same time they realized, wow, this is a super cash cow. And if we can just deceive the people, at least on some of the projects, we can take a bunch of change and continually smuggle that into whatever the hell we're doing, right? So you wonder how these agents get paid tremendous amounts of money. Now, we do have above-the-ground budgets for agencies. You know, we always talk about PSYOPs on the show. There is a Army group of PSYOPs that was formed, I believe, after the World War II, officially on paper. And I believe the budget at this point is around $1.5 billion a year. Now, it's probably gone up. But that we as citizens of America pay a contingency of our military to lie to us, to bully us online, to basically force the consciousness of man. They also infect all the news when you talk about, you know, various military articles that go up on the news and say this person's a bad person, this person's a good person. Now, some of that comes through AP Reuters, which again is the same organization owned by the Rothschilds, as far as we know. Again, the Rothschilds might be a Kaiser Sose. You know, now that we're seeing a giant immigration from the Middle East into Europe, we sort of wonder who's running the planet at this point, right? Because you'd think that some Karazhan Jews, which are Caucasian white people that have no Jewish blood in them, if they're the Rothschilds, then it doesn't make any sense that they're allowing the Middle East to push all their citizens into Europe. It's a little odd. But anyway, back to NASA. NASA ended up having a side company called Jet Propulsion Laboratories, which is up here in Pasadena. They have annexes all over the planet, but the big campus is up here in Pasadena. If any of you have been near the campus of JPL, it's protected like Fort Knox. And there's a lot of rational reasons why it would be protected like Fort Knox, because it definitely has tremendous technology behind the doors. But it's almost military. I accidentally have a bunch of friends in Pasadena, and on one occasion I actually turned into the gate of JPL just trying to get the hell out of town at one point because we were at some event and I didn't know where I was exactly. And it was really just prior to GPS tracking out of your telephone sort of thing. But, I was met by a pretty intense contingency of soldiers saying, you can't come this way, turn around, blah, blah, blah. And it was just very easy to get out of there. Now, Kyle and I talk about a lot where we know CG people, computer-generated scientists, and special effects people that have actually finished their stint in Hollywood, and they ended up working for JPL. And so I've said this on the show before in my essay, but I want to go to where we are today because people say, who cares about the moon missions being fake? It doesn't really bother me anymore. And I think that you just need to know the game that's being played on you by the JPL organization, and especially as it relates to the Mars missions. Okay. Now, you can do yourself a favor by looking up every country that's attempted to go to Mars, every country that's attempted to send a probe in that direction. I believe the last time I looked it up, which was probably about 10 years ago, it was like 39 out of 39 attempts by non-U.S. countries have failed to get anything remotely close enough to Mars to take a picture. And so all their calculations, all their astrophysics predictions about how to hurl something out of the Earth's orbit towards Mars completely and utterly failed. Okay, and I think you need to understand that a space program for a particular country is a matter of national pride. So when they send something up in the air and it comes right back down to Earth, they may not report it. They may say it got into orbit, or at least, escaped Earth's gravitational force and got close to Mars, but then just didn't land. It's a matter of national pride, But I have conducted interviews with individuals that I didn't realize I was about to do, where I asked these individuals who worked on some of the first CG movies ever made, and I said, well, what did you do after this film? And they said, we went to work for JPL for about 10 years. And I said, well, what did you do? And they said, well, we developed software to generate terrains that look photographic. And I'm like, oh, that's weird. So I asked them, I said, was that to, taking data from rovers and generate what they're seeing, or are you completely synthesizing this from nothing? And they said, oh, no, it's just completely synthesized from nothing. And I said, well, how good was it? And they said that before they left, and with three gentlemen that were at this particular party, one was not engaging in the interview and still worked at JPL, and he was pacing in the background behind me. And we're on this balcony in San Diego looking down at the city real late at night at this palatial suite at the top of this building. And the other two were just giddy to talk about it. And they said, look, we made software that you couldn't tell the difference between what we rendered in a computer and, real life. And this is like early 90s. This is before Jurassic Park was released. And this is what happens when you have infinite resources, computers that have monster processors, probably Silicon graphics machines, all the time in the world to devote yourself to it. I interviewed them a little bit further about, what kind of terrains they could do. And they essentially said that, the easiest terrains are like desert terrains, right? Where you have just essentially what we know as the Mars terrain. Now, they did not use the word Mars very specifically. But I'll tell you what, this dude behind us was looking at us like crazy. He was this really super pale guy, almost like albino, but not. He had white hair, really long. He was dressed in all black leather, and he had all these crazy, silver rings all over his hands. In fact, some looked like, to sniff coke. I mean, it was crazy. Everyone else in the room was completely normal human beings out of the special effects groups in Los Angeles, but this guy stood out like a sore thumb. And they pointed at him, and they said, he still works there. And he wouldn't join the conversation. It was really weird, but he paced within earshot and started smoking and looked really nervous, and it was really weird. That doesn't give you conclusive proof or anything that he's up to anything bad, but think about the way that we actually accept the fact that America has been to Mars. First and foremost, we get that usurpation of ability of mankind. We sit and we will look at the fact that we went to Mars and we pat ourselves on the back spiritually because look what man has accomplished. So that in itself is a defense mechanism against anyone telling you that the story isn't true. And that is overlooked constantly, but it's a very powerful and meaningful process, because it is the automatic defense mechanism. Like I said in the Satan episode, the more egregious and horrible these crimes are towards children and individuals, the less the human mind has the capability of looking at the data. Well, there's an inverse algorithm that's exactly the same, which is pride. A good thing is being claimed, and you can't not accept it, right? That kind of thing. They launch a rocket. They've actually had, and I remember when I was electronic arts, we used to watch these rocket launches whenever they'd happen, usually about 8 o'clock or so, California time. But we'd watch these rockets, and there's a video camera on the outside of the rocket. And so we see this thing, launch. Then there's usually a blackout period, and then it starts to crest into the orbit around Earth. And the thing that always got me was that it always goes into low orbit around Earth. That's the funny thing. And supposedly this thing, does its slingshot thing. But the camera always turns off during this magic process where it escapes Earth's gravitational force. I actually think that we don't quite have that down as a science, and I don't think we have the boosters to pull it off, simply because of von Braun's science of, the metric tons of force that need to come out of a motor to get us out of low orbit in Earth. But regardless, this thing is then said to, again, the camera turns off, and it's said to go to Mars. And then, of course, there's a big blackout period where all we have as proof is the telemetry from the rocket down to Earth. Again, you could run that same scam they did for the Apollo missions, where you have a satellite that's in low orbit sending down signals to Earth, pretending to be that rocket, right? And because the Earth turns, you just simply synchronize the orbit with where the rocket would be if it was headed towards Mars. Okay. Once it arrives, gets close to Mars, then we have this huge sequence that comes down as binary numbers, right, about where this thing is. Now, today, in the most recent, probe dropping, we actually have supposedly videos that are very chaotic. The camera's going nuts, and the level of detail on these cameras is horrific. We have 4K cameras that fit in your hand at the intelligence levels, and they don't seem to place any of these on these multi-million-dollar rockets, right? What would they be out? 10 grand, 20 grand, and they could film the most amazing event on Mars. At high K, you never see it, right? So then the thing lands, and again, it's just a bunch of data coming back from some weird satellites saying that this thing has landed. And then, of course, they all scream and yell. And what's funny is if you look at the faces of the individuals in the room, you have a bunch of people that appear to believe what's going on, and then you have a bunch of faces of people doing really shitty impersonations of how surprised they are that everything worked out, right? Then we get photographs back, right? We get photographs back from Mars, and that's the proof. A couple quick shots as soon as it lands, just kind of take pictures of the area. And then over time, this rover starts driving around and starts sawing up rocks and starts taking pictures of vistas and that kind of thing. And if you look at the actual photographs from NASA of Mars and start to zoom into them, and I used to save these things. When I believed it, I used to save these things and then zoom into them just to kind of see what's on the terrain and that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of anomalies in the way these things are composited, and especially between the terrain itself and the sky. There's usually a weird line in there, which wouldn't necessarily correlate with the idea that it's taking a bunch of photographs and sewing them all together in a panorama, right? That should be just blocky, weird things. But there shouldn't be any seam right between the terrain and the sky itself. That's just something I noticed. No one's ever mentioned that. But it's a picture game. JPL renders pictures way before the mission occurs, has scientists vet them for acceptability, launches the rocket, goes into low orbit. Perhaps it just falls out of the sky because they can't achieve consistent low orbit, or they use it for some other purpose. Maybe it's a spy satellite, but you're paying for it, right? You're paying for this cargo to go up in the sky, and then all you're fed is video back. Now, it seems like if this 3D rendering technology is real, you have a kind of a combination of things going on between really beautiful vistas, which can be rendered in a computer easily, right? When you look at Transformers and all these crazy movies, you can't tell the difference between reality and CG. But you look at Pixar, and they've made everything look a little cartoony. Now you take that same skill set, that same science, okay, and you try to make it real, like these guys I interviewed, and you can make it real. Now we are 25 years past the guys that I talked to who said they made photoreal terrain software. Now why would JPL buy such a thing? What's the point? You don't need photoreal terrains to simulate anything, right? It would be like a weird waste of money, So if you're going to simulate, you just need the physics of the terrain, right? The physics of a rock here and there, and then you put the probe in with this weird wheel configuration just to make sure it can actually go over the terrains and not get locked up, right? And we can run simulations here on Earth with the drones, or not the drones, but the rovers, and test them out here. So you don't need this software at any level within JPL, yet JPL has been confirmed to have paid people over 10 years to develop this stuff. And again, that one guy behind me still worked for them. So it means he's worked for them for, I guess it'd be almost 35 years, right? Now, put a pin in that for 1 second. Let's rewind to 1984. 1984 movie came out, which was the sequel to 2001 Space Odyssey, ironically, called 2010, directed by Peter Hyams. Now, as a part of the making of that film, they did an interview at JPL where they had two individuals in a room with a big 35-inch monitor, tube monitor, because that's all they had back in the day, and they had simulated in a computer Jupiter. Sphere with full liquid dynamics, all, the cloud systems turning on the surface of Jupiter. And if any of you have seen the film, it's extremely convincing that it's a real object, right? Now, you could split hairs, but again, we're 20 years past that particular technology and then change, right? They had planetary simulation software as well. Now, remember the Voyagers, right? The Voyagers went out and took basically crappy pictures of all these planets, heavily shadowed, just really kind of a gas giant sort of thing where it's like a blue haze, easily simulated with the software that they had for 2010. Again, developed at JPL, right? So these movies are sort of the catalyst to test the acceptability of their software. And as soon as someone sees the film and they interview people coming out of the theater, they realize everyone's buying it. And so they jack up the resolution, they jack up the details and perhaps the science, and you can start selling pictures to the world under these giant envelopes of billion-dollar rockets, right? And NASA's actually had their budgets clipped a couple times and then increased. But some of you might remember a probe that was actually sent to Mars in 1998. We've talked about it a little bit on the show, that crashed into the surface of Mars. And when, NASA was asked, why did this thing crash? They said, we had one module that was developed in standard measurement units and one that was developed in metric units, and nobody tested that. And so when it got to Mars, it crashed into the surface. Now, for any of you who've done software development, even in the mid-'80s, the quality assurance teams that test software test it profusely before it goes out, right? We're looking for crash bugs, we're looking for anomalies and that kind of thing. I used to date a girl who worked on the Tomahawk missile program out of Port Hueneme here in Oxnard, Ventura area. And she worked on that system for 10 years with a bunch of guys that actually came over to the tax software company that's now TurboTax, right? So the amount of testing that I heard about, they just would lament and talk about this testing that they did was tremendous. And there's no way that a rocket and a payload headed for Mars is going to lack any type of testing, and especially between a metric and standard unit. Your first day of testing, you would say, oh my God, this isn't working out. What's going on here? And they'd have to build some translation algorithm between the two, which we do it all the time in software. When you send a piece of software over to Europe that has any measurement in it, they're going to be dealing in metric a lot of times, and you have to just translate. It's very easy. So I'm going to suggest to you that particular crash was due to the fact that the pictures that they were going to sell us weren't ready and they weren't convincing. There's some type of anomaly in the program of selling this stuff. Perhaps they had the date to launch the rocket and they had the team that was making the photographs. And again, this is one of the very first times we're going to make really photorealistic claims of Mars, right? Now, some of our viewers have actually brought up a very interesting point, and that is that when we look at Mars from Earth with giant telescopes, the picture of Mars that we get and the terrain that we see in the picture categorically does not match what NASA has brought back with its reconnaissance satellites that are supposedly going around Mars and taking a ton of pictures, just like the spy satellites we have on Earth, right? And so that begs a huge question. There appears to be sort of a brighter surface than the one that we actually see. We've told ourselves that Mars is a giant rust bucket. It's all iron rock rusting. And again, the photographs from NASA confirm their story. But there's a more insidious thing going on now with the Mars missions. Okay, and you see this in the news. The Drudge Report just had it. September 11th, they just dropped a report that says that And Neil deGrasse Tyson toes this line too. And Neil deGrasse takes it insanely over to Venus as well. But there's this huge thing about climate change, right? And they're trying to sell carbon taxation to the people to supposedly fix the world. You know, it doesn't matter that I get 10 tons of junk mail in my mailbox every day, and they're cutting down forests left and right. We care about the world, but we won't stop that unsolicited bullshit, right? We don't have any problem with burning oil constantly as opposed to getting over to some natural gas, 0-point energy system out of hydrogen, tap water. As Stan Myers, you need to go look up Stan Myers if you think there's any problem metabolizing tap water into hydrogen. We don't need fuel cells. We don't need that fancy stuff. They give us crappy systems to hold us back, right? Because if we use Stan Myers' system, he was assassinated in 1998 by drinking some cranberry juice with his family, and he essentially started feeling horrible immediately and said, they got me. And he ran outside and fell face down in his front lawn. And that's after they'd offered him about $1.1 billion to shut the hell up, and he refused. He was a religious man. He thought that the angels were protecting him. But he built a $1,500 kit that you could put in your car, and you essentially just unscrewed the distribution wires to your spark plugs, unscrewed the spark plug, put in his hydrogen fracturing system, and tap water goes all the way down to that point, right where the cylinder is, and it would fracture it into hydrogen, and you were set. You didn't have to you didn't have to buy a new car or anything. He was going to shut down the oil business overnight. It just took him a little too long to pull it off, but he was actually selling this and installing this in cars when he died. All right, so this worked. He drove completely across the United States on 3 gallons of tap water. There's a whole story behind that guy that I've covered in the past, but maybe I'll do a full-blown deep thoughts on that guy. You can actually get the schematics for what he did. So, Mars. Mars is being used as a technique to say that Mars had life, right? There's no sign of life on Mars, even with their bullshit stories about water, distributing over the surface. If a big comet were to hit Mars, like a big one, it would liquefy into water, make a few waves, evaporate, and be gone. It doesn't mean life existed on Mars. And it's even if their bullshit stories about what we're seeing from Mars are actually true, which we no longer believe are true. Okay, but people like Neil deGrasse Tyson are going to like these town hall meetings and telling everyone that that we know it for a fact. We know it for a fact that Mars had life, which has never been confirmed by NASA, and that it died, due to a big cataclysmic environmental problem. And that if we don't tax us here on Earth, that we're going to have the exact same problem that Mars had. He's also repeated that about Venus. Venus was completely lush. It's really close to the sun, has nearly a complete sulfuric acid, atmosphere and cyanide atmosphere. And, a funny thing about the Venus mission, supposedly we put an orbiter around Venus as well. And there's a guy that I've attended his class called Edward Tufte. Edward Tufte is a guy that's a mastermind of designing information into pictures so that people can get the information in their brain extremely fast. And he's hired to do all kinds of stuff. He's been hired by NASA several times. But he busts NASA, and again, this is sort of wonky science, right? Whether or not we can send an orbiting vehicle around a neighboring planet is in huge question at this point. But whatever data they got back from this orbiter that went into Venus's orbit. Now, supposedly the orbiter would have just been eaten alive by the actual atmosphere itself, just dissolved it, But they said that the terrain that they got back was so shallow and so unorganic, it was just sort of like little tiny bumpy hills that NASA wasn't satisfied with the way it was going to look when they supposedly sold the information back to United States citizens. And so they multiplied all the terrain information by 20 times just to make sure a little tiny molehill turned into a mountain. And so they could fly through this crazy mountainous terrain and say, oh, it looks like a sci-fi, novel cover. Now, some of us doubt they ever pulled it off in the first place, but NASA has been exposed as liars 20 billion times, right? So for instance, when the 1986 shuttle crash happened, when the explosion happened, they were warned the day before for over 13 hours straight. They had a big 13-hour meeting the day before where these scientists were like, this thing's gonna blow up and the O-rings are gonna crack. And they did all this data, and this is where Edward was hired by NASA afterwards to figure out how they could avoid this problem. But he created this beautiful image that they had actually presented the information, but they presented it in such an analytical way and just having numbers on pages that no one was able to see how clearly evident this thing was going to have a problem. And so what he did was he created this graph of temperature from, I believe, the 38 degrees or whatever that morning was. It was super duper cold in Florida, which is a crazy anomaly, all the way up to the normal launches. And then he backtracked in this thing, put notches at every degree that they actually launched the space shuttle, and said how many things went wrong every time the temperature got colder. And I believe that the coldest launch at that point was like somewhere around 68, 69 degrees, and a ton of shit went wrong. So he said, look, you launch at this really cold temperature and you blast out rockets that are going to put, 2,000 or 3,000 degree Fahrenheit flames by parts. We're going to have, rupturing. And so when the space shuttle blew up, they had to launch an investigation, right? So Edward comes in around the back, and he doesn't say anything for about 10 years. But Richard Feynman, the master physicist, who was a big quantum mechanics guy, was hired to actually lead the group. And in his bio that I read in 88, the year he died, he said that he was had because they kept leading him on about a bunch of crappy things, that weren't the reason. And then the head of NASA had him over for dinner one night. So it's that guy, his wife, and Feynman. And then as soon as dinner's over, he takes Feynman in the garage and he opens up a carburetor because the guy was obsessed with carburetors. And if you know anything about cars, they're magical little instruments that really control the proficiency of an engine, right? Oxygen mixture with gasoline, all that kind of stuff. But he had a carburetor ready to explain this to Feynman, and it was all set up. He pulls an O-ring, a little rubber ring, out of a carburetor that had cracked due to temperature. And he said, you know what I was thinking? He said, maybe it was the temperature that we launched the space shuttle at that caused the O-ring to crack, and then that's what actually penetrated the main fuel cell, and boom, right? And he goes, I realized this guy had set me up, and he was pissed because this guy's from Brooklyn. Feynman's from Brooklyn. He had a Brooklyn accent, but he was a genius. And so he was pissed that his name was dragged through this thing and that he had been had by NASA. So in terms of NASA lying to you constantly, it's deeper than we're going into in this episode here, right? So the moon missions have turned into the Mars missions now. And again, if anybody does any basic logistics in their brain, we would never go to Mars first before going back to the moon. We just wouldn't do it because all the technology is claimed to have been lost by NASA. They lost the schematics to the Saturn V. I mean, how ridiculous is that, right? They got one lying on its side in Florida, right? And I'm sure they've yanked all the boosters out and stuff, but people built this stuff that are still alive. You could ask questions, but they've lost the recipe for the Saturn V. They don't want anyone to examine the physics of the Saturn V to prove to them and the rest of the world that this rocket could have never escaped Earth's gravitational force. It could have never made it into high orbit, let alone to the moon, right? Remember our analogy, right? The 8-foot ceiling, you've got a couple centimeters at the bottom, which is the furthest that NASA had ever been able to push anything into orbit, right? Now, they've also, accidentally recorded over all the original moon footage. In 2009, they had to announce that. Now, as Kyle said on our show, the machines that record this tape are no longer in production. They haven't been in production for 40 years. And so in order to record over the original footage of the moon mission, you would actually have to resurrect that machine, blow the dust off, hope the damn thing turns on, and then insert these tapes, feed them through, record something else, which there's nothing new to record on old stuff, right? It's ridiculous. What are you going to do? Record a little comedy show, right? So the whole assertion that they have lost all of the moon missions should be proof to you that NASA's up to no good. And the fact that they're supposedly trying to go to Mars, which if it was real, if everything that NASA's told you was real, and let's just forget the Orion project, which is trying to figure out how to push flesh into the Van Allen belts without killing the astronauts inside, right? They've admitted they can't do it, which means they've admitted they haven't been anywhere in high orbit with the human body, especially the moon, right? But if everything they said was true, they are picking probably the most logistical, dangerous mission they could possibly pick next. Right? Going to the moon would be the easiest thing in the world to do. If we've obviously been there 6 times and we had this all figured out. And again, remember how powerful the computers were inside these rockets way back in '69. They were nothing, right? The first CG movies that were ever rendered in the early 80s, the average iPhone 4S has a million times more processing power than the supercomputers that rendered the first movies, Last Starfighter, Tron, that kind of stuff, right? So we have massive computer technology now to supposedly make all the logistics to the moon very, very safe. And we should be wanting to go there. We should just want to go for a lot of reasons because we haven't been back since. But they've got you off on this bullshit idea that we're going to go to Mars, right? And they've just put a bunch of astronauts inside of like an agrodome for 2 years, right? They're not going to see daylight for 2 years just to see how it psychologically affects man. And I'm going to say that if they ever pull off this mission, that'll be one of the test sites where they actually film footage and talk to these folks, right? Unfortunately, NASA cannot be trusted. There's a bunch of our viewers, and I'm just going to end this thing with some of the skeptics that are out there, and I have to say they're starting to make some sense on some levels, and other levels it's just not conclusive. It's just guys talking over video, making assertions that we need to investigate, we need to add the science to it. But there's a lot of debate about the existence of satellites in general, and there's really two main arguments against, right? The simplest argument, which is actually very interesting, is that the pictures of Earth from space are either few and ancient, right? They're pictures that they took during the Apollo missions, right? Or they are new and they're all computer generated. And so we don't have beautiful photographs of the Earth. We should have literally thousands of new photographs of Earth coming in daily with all the supposedly space junk we have in space, right? Now, in terms of satellites existing, I think one can just watch some of these rockets that have the video cameras on the outside, and you just watch it go up. You literally see, Cape Canaveral disappear, and it goes up through the clouds, and we watch it occur with really intense cameras. I think low orbit, at a minimum, is very, very doable, and I would say low orbit's about 200 miles and down from the atmosphere, right? The space shuttle, and I actually misquoted it by 100 miles, or 75 miles. The space shuttle at 375 was supposedly, when they got 375 miles up, started suffering massive radiation due to the Van Allen belts, which is only, again, it's 1,000 miles up, so it's an easy percentile rate. 37% of the way towards the Van Allen belts, the astronauts started dying. And this was reported, and they didn't die, but they started puking their guts out and being real nauseous and that kind of stuff because the radiation poisoning was crazy, right? But NASA reported that, CNN reported that in 1998, saying that NASA has discovered that the Van Allen belts are more dangerous than they previously imagined. And that article would not have been released if the Van Allen belts were safe. Okay, and again, their Ryan project, currently going right now, 2015, is to try to figure out how to do it. Build a capsule that insulates against radiation. My guys said, look, just solar radiation, which is a fraction of the Van Allen belts. You'd have to put 6 inches of water around the capsule, and there's no way to get 6 inches of water around a gigantic capsule in space. You'd have to send it to space without the water and somehow synthesize it out of nothing, because you can't carry that much water into space with our boosters. You have to send up a bunch of water in tiny little packets if you're going to do it, right? So NASA has definitely been caught trying to pawn off computer-generated art as actual photographs from satellites. And again, those of us in computer graphics and who know it really well know that it's all bullshit. And recently, they just released a horrible GIF, these animated photographs on the web of the dark side of the moon crossing in front of Earth. And it has to be the most lowbrow, ridiculous piece of artwork released from whatever JPL NASA that's been pawned off as real life, And what's funny about it is that, we've mentioned on the show before that the CG stuff's always, there's a lot of kids out there playing with software and getting their chops with the stuff and trying to make things look photoreal. And there's all kinds of fake plane crashes, fake UFOs, all kinds of stuff that are pawned off, and people buy it. And they'll actually post it on their Facebook wall saying, "Oh my God, look at this." And any one of us with rotoscoping knowledge realizes that, they've done a good job, but they still haven't done the convincing job, because the way that the camera is panning, the plane will actually overlay on top of the building every once in a while at the edges, and so we can see it's fake right away. But the average human being has no idea how computer graphics works at all, right? They think of paint applications, someone clicking pixels in a screen, and they say, well, if there's no way that someone could click a pixel and make it look real. But they don't understand how movies like Transformers occur, or Pacific Rim, which, they're all these movies are dialed back to look a little bit cartoony. They're not allowed to be at the massive level that JPL can invest. And it's simply because of a matter of time in the rendering farms. When you send a frame in to be rendered, it takes hours to do. I think the Finding Nemo, by Pixar, one of my buddies was the head animator on that movie. He told me that when they decided to do the water correctly, that one frame of that movie, and we're talking about at least 24 frames a second, I think they pushed it way up past 30, took 27 hours to render one frame of that film. And they have a budget. They got a timeline. So they calculate which scenes are going to be actually made photoreal and which scenes are going to be lighter, right? So everything out of the water rendered much quicker. Everything in the water took a long time. So they had to sanction the script to say, how many shots do we have in the water? How much time do we have? How much money do we have? And they do the best job they can. And that's why Pixar's incredibly celebrated for its abilities, because they pull it off every single time. But NASA doesn't have any measurable limitations when they want to do what they do, right? And they have more computers. They own them themselves. It's on their farm. And I think that the Mars missions are actually a combination of live action, meaning real, movies of rocks, and because what you don't ever see the arm go out and just saw the rock off. You see little stills of the arm extending, and then you get this final product of a rock that's been cut in half, and they've got all these anomalies of rocks that rolled into little balls, and then they cut them in half, and they say, oh my gosh, look how real this is, So they developed a science that then you're evaluating to say it's real. So they tell you what is going to be true if you see it, and then you see it. And so the whole paradigm is completely controlled by them. If they said, look at this water on Mars, and then they gave you pictures of water, then you'd say, well, we know we were looking for water, and look at this picture of water. Oh, that's the truth, right? So they completely control the game, soup to nuts, right? I think you'll also find that there was an interesting thing, I should say, with Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan actually came out and was completely on board with the moon being a hoax. And then he made a podcast show, and he was trying to sell it for about $6 million. And so I think that as he tried to make his show more commercial, he was pulling back out of these. I'm afraid of what people think about me because it's going to affect the business deal that I'm actually negotiating. But he got on, I believe it was Coast to Coast AM, was George Norrie, and they had this NASA guy on that was going to refute all of Joe's claims. And Joe is a busy man, does not have the time to be a nerd like me and get into all the science, right? But he mentioned the Van Allen belts to this guy on Coast to Coast, and the answer was unbelievably ridiculous, cartoony, and uneducated by this NASA guy. And the NASA guy was in overdrive for trying to passively aggressively attack Joe and everything that he said. How stupid he was. But I know you're just stupid because you're a good guy and you're just trying to find the truth, right? So it was this huge passive aggressive interview where he was basically trying to take Joe down in everyone else's eyes. Who doesn't want to believe it's a hoax, right? So he's like, oh yeah, of course Joe's an idiot. He's a UFC narrator and that kind of thing. Joe was right to begin with, okay? But he said, look, the Van Allen belts are totally deadly. We've done the physics on the capsule. If you take a 1/4-inch aluminum capsule and push it through the Van Allen belts, regardless of how dense or light they are, that will actually create a microwave inside the capsule and fry all the astronauts. And so the NASA guy actually agrees with him and says, yeah, you're right. But you know what? He said the Saturn V rocket actually went around the Earth, and when it was slingshotting through the Van Allen belts, it went through the North Pole where the Van Allen belts don't exist. And it snuck through this hole, right? Okay, so that's a very specific maneuver. If you go to Bart Siebel's movie, Astronauts Gone Wild, the astronauts have no knowledge of the Van Allen belts. None of them had any knowledge of the Van Allen belts at all. So there's this crazy specific maneuver that the astronauts aren't debriefed on, right? It's absurd. The vehicle didn't have any retro rocket systems to create such an acute angle turn through this thing. And the funny thing was that this guy was completely uneducated about how the Van Allen belts work. What happens is when you go look up the Van Allen belts, just do it while you're on the show. Pull up another browser and take a look at the Van Allen belts, right? They'll show you this sort of plume coming out of the top of the Earth, of the North Pole, and then it goes around and creates this big balloon around the Earth and then goes back into the South Pole. And that's the way it's always drawn on paper. There seems to be this V at the top with nothing because it's ejecting from the top of the Earth, and there's a V at the bottom where it's all coming back in. And there's supposedly these unexposed holes at the top and bottom. Now, if that was the case, when a coronal mass ejection comes from the Earth, the North Pole and the South Pole would essentially liquefy within seconds. But it's not the way that actually works. That's an artist rendering trying to tell you the vector trajectory of the electrons that come out of the center of the Earth, because the Earth has a huge plasma electrical interior, not a nickel interior. That's been completely made up, and God knows, like 200 years ago, just explain, well, when we put nickel in a piece of paper and run magnets through it, it's not. It's all electrical inside the Earth. So is the sun. Okay. But anyway, whether or not you want to buy the interior of the sun idea, for me, I don't care. At the top and the bottom, you actually have the highest level of velocity and density of these deadly particles. Because if you just do the math in your brain, it's actually spitting it out so fast and so furious, right, that it actually wraps around the Earth. It doesn't come back immediately to the Earth. So it's spitting it out so fast and so dense that it actually creates the pole around the Earth. And you can better believe that the trajectory math at the bottom actually just completely mirrors the top. So saying that the NASA Saturn V capsule went through these areas where the picture in your grade school classroom shows a hole at the top and bottom, you're actually sending it through the densest, most deadly area of the Van Allen belts. So that was the turning point in the conversation on Coast to Coast AM, where Joe gave up, right? And I think Joe wanted to give up. One, he has the patriotic hope to believe in it, but two, he's trying to sell a show for $6 million plus, and he may have done it by now, right? And whatever, he's got to pay his bills, and truth doesn't seem to matter to that guy. His pocketbook does, because he needs $6 million, right? That's how the world works. When you get to the top, you get greedy, and truth doesn't matter anymore, which is why I like being at the bottom and speaking the truth, because I have nothing to gain by telling you guys this stuff, except for the hope that perhaps you'll tell your kids that if they ever make it to the moon, they're probably the first human being to do it, right? And that's what's super duper important. Now, let's dial back into NASA for 1 second. We know a giant swab of NASA has actually been taken over. Again, it was formed by Nazis, so let's not romanticize their objectives, right? And again, I think it's probably diluted quite a bit since Operation Paperclip. But the people at the top who control these folks down below and deceive, I would suggest that 98 to 99% of the NASA staff is completely deceived as well. There's not a bunch of people in on the cabal. They're simply looking at instruments. They're all sheep anyway. Scientists are sheep. Scientists do not think for themselves on average, and the ones that do are the ones that turn into the Isaac Newtons, the Copernicus, the Galileos. They're the ones that actually mastermind new technology, but we don't live in that culture today. When you got a nerd that can't think of any way to be celebrated because they're not picking up the chicks like they normally do, the way they're going to do it is to say that they're smart. How do you become smart? You memorize and repeat, and you don't think, right? So at the top of NASA just needs to be a small contingency of folks that actually think and mastermind these ways to create liquid cash into these organizations to do whatever they need to do, right? Inside NASA, because of the Orion project in general, you actually have a contingency that's trying to figure out how to do it. There's a couple reasons to want to leave Earth's orbit. One, it's to just investigate our neighbors. Perhaps we could live on the moon, maybe. What you need to understand about space travel too, which is very rarely mentioned, is the following. If you were to take a trip from Los Angeles to Denver on an airplane, right, on a jet, which is, for those of you who don't know the distance, about 1,800 miles, you have been exposed to a chest X-ray of radiation from the atmosphere. Okay, that's quite a bit of radiation, and for those who travel in business, you got to be super duper careful, because the one thing you're not doing is you don't wear what the pilots wear, which is a little lapel clip, right, that has a little piece of film in it. And pilots carry these things. They're clipped in there. It's just two pieces of steel pushed together with a piece of film in there. And the last time I saw one, it was about the size of one of those mints you get from the restaurant back in the day, right? It was chocolate and mint, right? Those things get handed in, and they essentially measure how much radiation you're getting as a pilot. And at one point, they basically say you've got too much radiation, you've reached your maximum, and you're no longer allowed to fly. So for these astronauts to be up in low orbit, even 200 miles, the amount of radiation they're getting on their bodies is phenomenal. And there's nothing that's going to stop it from occurring, right? Because we don't have a special layer of perhaps a Faraday-type metal on the outside of a vehicle. This is my idea to say, look, why don't we take the principles of Faraday, which relies on a steady current of electricity. You can't do it with variable currents. And just essentially say, let's look at the current, the average current of the Van Allen belts and try to push through. And you could even metabolize that energy into a power source if you could get into, electric based power supplies up in space, right? But the other big thing is that about the satellites, I forgot to loop back on this, which is that the Earth gets pummeled constantly with, I think it's over 40 tons of meteorites a year. And my physics teacher taught it when I took astronomy from him. He said that there's over 100 million meteorites per minute that actually collide with the Earth's atmosphere. And he's talking about BBs and big ones, but most of the time, little tiny particles that constantly hit the Earth's atmosphere and fry. Now, again, that's what the Van Allen belts are all about. But if it gets through the Van Allen belts and hits our atmosphere, the friction heats up and burns the little doodad, and it's gone, right? But these satellites are above and between that layer. And so in terms of putting a satellite up there for long-term amounts of time, if any of you have seen the movie Gravity, gravity is happening constantly, right? That what's happening in that movie is happening constantly, except that in that movie it was much larger rocks. But you wouldn't need anything other than a pea-sized rock traveling 35,000 miles an hour. If it hits you, if you took a BB and you hit somebody with it at 35,000 miles an hour, you're going to turn their body into goo instantaneously. So you'll talk to people that are talking, defending the space station. There's a lot of theories that the space station might be a complete hoax as well. And I think there's very credible evidence to suggest that at least some of the footage in this space station that they claim is from the space station is actually forged. There's astronauts twirling little stuffed animals, and they look like they're on strings. So they'll flip it forward, and the thing starts flipping. And as the string tightens that's holding this thing in place, it starts to rewind, and the astronaut grabs it at the last second. That cannot happen in the space station. There's no inverse force that just all of a sudden introduces itself, right? And these they seem to be wearing harnesses under their bodies, but we don't see any cords in the room. It would make sense to me to harness an astronaut in for an interview so they just don't float around. They can just effortlessly take the interview and not worry about stabilizing themselves. But they wear the harness, but you don't see any wires coming off of it. Really odd, right? So it gives a lot of reasons to ask the questions. And again, because NASA has been so synonymous with hoaxes, we have to ask these questions about every reason why they take our cash, right? And again, the byproducts from the space station are almost negligible. What are they doing up in the space station? There should be there should be almost monthly reports about we discovered this, we discovered that, because we're shoveling cash at this big thing in space. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is that I noticed, because we have a fan that's putting a lot of energy into this, and I want him to keep going because people are starting to come up with some fairly decent representations. And again, a lot of it's just videos where the guy laughs over the video and points out things. And I think that method of communicating about a hoax is probably not going to add a lot of credibility. It's the people that are very stoic. They're saying, look, this can't be done, this can't be done, this can't be done. It's a little easier to digest, just for me at least, right? But the space station doesn't have this report of what's going on. But again, we're shoveling cash at it. And so again, I think we need to turn up the screws on NASA. And I think that right now I've noticed that there's a ton of NASA photographs and evidence from them, right, that's trying to say, look at the space station, look at the space station, look at the space. Now, before our fan actually started propagating this stuff up to the Facebook page, I never really, I still watch the same channels. I hadn't seen NASA get so paranoid about people believing in the space station. But in the last year, I've seen a huge increase in skeptics videos. I mean, this thing is blowing up on YouTube. If you haven't seen the videos, go look up fake ISS. Just the International Space Station, just do ISS, fake, or ISS hoax or something like that. And you'll see, regardless if you believe it or not, you'll see a tremendous amount of videos. I would say we're damn near in the thousands at this point of people pointing out structural anomalies. And there's an architect that actually went in and broke down the integrity of the actual design of the vehicle and said this would never work in space, especially if astronauts are floating around in zero-point gravity. They've run these things through simulations and software and said, look, this thing would break if there's the slightest anomaly and someone jumping up and down. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. But at the same time, NASA is now shoveling stuff at the world, saying, look at the space station, look at this, and it's just indirectly saying, look how it's real, look how it's real. And then the last thing I saw 2 days ago was and this comes out every once in a while, a picture of the sun, through a filter, and they did this little kind of time lapse in one frame of the space station crawling across the, as a silhouette crawling across this picture of the sun, sort of, lowbrow, who gives a shit kind of picture, but it's someone's taking time out of their day to create images like this, which I think is very interesting. So, moon missions, just as a summary for you and your friends, okay? this idea that 1,000 people would have to be involved in on this is not true. All right. And I forgot to mention a really cool thing that occurred. A British documentary worker went to Australia, and when just to recap for you, when the moon missions went up, they know the Earth's orbiting, and so if there's any one satellite trying to figure out where this rocket is leaving the Earth and going to the moon, right? As it rotates, they had to put 3 base stations around the world. So when it rotates, they always had contact with the Apollo capsule, at least the theory of it, right? Well, he went to this sort of alumni kind of reunion of these old guys. This was done in the last 10 years, of the guys that ran the radar station in Australia. And the guy shows up, and he says, he gets to tell them their whole story. Yeah, man, we watched, we got the telemetry data from the Apollo mission as it was happening. We're so proud to be involved with this. And they're all old guys, right? So they have really nothing to lose by getting into the truth. But there was one guy that was a little bit younger than the rest, probably by at least 10, 15 years. Like visibly, he was much more, he was still old, but he looked younger. Okay, anyway, the guy said, look, couldn't this have been done by a satellite in low orbit around Earth? And all these guys, all but one, right, said, oh my God, yeah, that could totally work. And within seconds, all these guys realized they could have been duped. But this one guy that was a little younger, and I can't find this document. I don't even know how to look it up. But some of you, if you guys know where that video is, please, dear God, post it down below, because I've been dying to see this again. But the one guy that was a little bit younger walks up and sits down, and he goes, I don't think we should be talking about this. Boom, right? And I want to say something about low orbit satellites existing. We do have the 54-minute video that Bart Siebel got that he put in his movie, not the whole thing, but of them faking the Earth shots through this portal window, right? And that is a capsule in low orbit taking pictures of Earth through a portal window. So that shows you a vehicle in low orbit as part of the hoax. So I think we can essentially say that we don't know how long they can keep things up into orbit. I think geocentric is something that's very questionable, because it's supposed to be about 36,000 miles up, and that would breach, way beyond where the space shuttle and all the other satellites go, right? So I think that there might be some definite problems with that, because it gets hot up there, right? Once metal starts getting exacerbated by electrons, even if they're not that dense, and again, they're dense enough to fend off a coronal mass ejection. So again, we haven't fried on Earth one time since we've gained an atmosphere, right? Since we gained the Van Allen belts, right? Which I think is the exceptional base requirements. The critical mass to create a planet is you have this plasma energy that gets a cold coating, which we call the crust, right? And inside it's just a furnace of credible electricity. You get the Van Allen belts from day one, right? But because it's strong enough to fend off a coronal mass ejection, I think you can assume that they're extremely volatile, right? I've had people try to tell me, oh, well, you don't understand, man. They're really, it's not that dense up there, so humans can go through it because it's not that dense. And I'm like, are you joking, right? It's almost tantamount to you having a force field around your head, and I can throw a bowling ball at your face as hard as I can. It's going to bounce off this frickin', it's not quite that intense, but it's very, very, very powerful to fend off thermal radiation from the sun, right? You're just talking about straight up hydrogen helium coming at the Earth and with an electrical substrate through it, and it fends it off completely and beautifully. I would actually imagine that everything that we get hit by with the sun starts to metabolize it gains it, right? It grabs it and moves it into the bowels of the Earth at the subatomic particle level, and that's why Earth expands, right? Earth expands 19 centimeters a year, right? And I'll just throw that out there as a little bonus here, because I got some energy, and this is the second day. If you haven't already, go look up Expanding Earth, okay? Just look up Expanding Earth. It's going to be a guy named Neil Adams. He's actually, unfortunately, for people who are looking for the credible hardback, science, they poo-poo this guy, but he's a genius. In the 60s, he was taught this in school, no big deal, the Earth expands, and that the Pangea drift theory is all bullshit, because if you evaporate all the oceans off of the Earth, meaning get rid of that part of the oceans, or the Earth's surface, if you shrink all the oceans, all the continents come completely together on all sides, not just in one little island that then splits up and floats around. There's no geological mechanisms that explains continents drifting on the Earth's surface. It doesn't happen, right? Well, what does happen is that the Earth is injected with subatomic particles from the sun that then create a force on the interior of this plasma core, right? Because plasma can grow beautifully. If you say it's a nickel core, then it becomes a finite amount of matter in there, and you'd have to put more nickel in to make the Earth expand. But because it's a plasma ball, plasma is very easy to grab out of the universe, especially out of a coronal mass ejection once it's metabolized back into its fundamental particles, and the Earth expands, again, 19 centimeters a year, right? And there's a bunch of organizations trying to quash that data, but that data was complete common knowledge in the 90s. In the last 15 years, they've tried to just the mathematics to erase the 19 centimeters, right? Okay. The main reason why I believe this has been suppressed, one, I don't know why anyone would hang on to the Pangea drift theory. Who gives a shit about that, right? Are you losing sleep because that's not true? I don't think so, right? It's just something you've been taught. Hey, yeah, Pangea drift, whatever. It doesn't make any sense. So saying that Earth expands is pretty easy. But what ended up happening was that the Earth's crust had two pretty weak points in it, which, as this thing expanded, the Earth's crust started creating new plates. And there's a guy that's been tracking these plates for 25 years. He's given them names. He watches them come out of the bowels of the Pacific and the bowels of the Atlantic. If you go look on Google Earth, look at the Pacific and the Atlantic, you'll see a seam right down the center of both oceans. And that's where the new surface is coming out of the bowels of the Earth, right? And it's basically magma that dries and cools down and becomes plate, right? Well, the Pacific is way weaker and thinner than the Atlantic, which is why the Atlantic is a little bit smaller. But this guy had reverse engineered the oceans, and he said there's a couple scientists that have actually reverse engineered the oceans that have nothing to do with expanding Earth. It's a couple German scientists which look at the salt buildup in the ocean, and they said, look, these things can't be more than maybe 60 million years old at its current salt level, because we're about to, it gains salt because it's all the byproduct, the biological matter that rots in the ocean. They keep measuring it, but they went reverse engineer back to clean non-salt water, and they're like, look, this is not that old. Which 60 million seems very short for me, but whatever. People have said that the oceans aren't something that has been here the entire time. But anyway, this guy did the mathematics on it, and Google Earth's going to be a lot of fun once I tell you this. He said that the Pacific and the Atlantic were actually sanctioned from each other due to land masses that actually created sort of a tub from one ocean to the other, and that at one point it broke, and that the breaking point was at the Indonesian islands, right? So you take China, go off the coast of China, and find the Indonesian islands, and just look at this on Google Earth. It's absolutely evident that this occurred, right? But he said, look, I think that the Indian Ocean as connected to the Atlantic was a mile higher than the Pacific. And at one day, it broke. You've seen dams break, the natural dams, when you build like a little sand castle or something. You bring a bunch of water in from the beach, and when it breaks, it just absolutely tears it apart. If you've seen a mudslide break through a natural barrier, it just takes a couple seconds and the whole thing breaks. But look at the Indonesian islands. You can actually see how the ocean, based on his theory, collapsed into the Atlantic Ocean and created a huge sludge mark where it moved a bunch of that mass that was holding it back down into the bottom of the ocean floor. And then you have this wave of water that's coming into the Pacific Ocean from the Atlantic, balancing the two out. We're going to have a lot of land that gets submerged in water, which is why I think the Midwest of America has actually got a lot of fossils in there, right? It took a while for it to dry back out. But he suggested that a lot of the mountainscapes that we have here on the coast of California might have just been the concussion from this wave actually slamming into California back in the prehistoric days and slamming a bunch of the soil up to create these mountains. It's very interesting, right? But I want to tell you that as you travel the world and you're driving down a highway and it's some rustic area, and for those of you in Europe, you have beautiful examples of this, and those of us in the South in America, Arizona, New Mexico area, you either have plateaus that are really, really high, and so you can assume that the top of that plateau is where Earth was at one point, and then as it expanded, if you take a piece of land and you pull it apart, right, and for those of you who are not watching on YouTube, you don't get these amazing hand gestures, but you pull it apart, you're going to have essentially it cave in, right? It's going to fall this way, it's going to fall that way, and when you drive down the highway, you'll constantly see these slatted slates in the land, especially if you go to Havasu. It's very interesting. Lake Havasu, which is a man-made lake, you have all these slanted crust plates, right? And that's because of expansion. So you had layers that are being pulled apart. Eventually, it's going to corrode with rain and water, and it's going to basically fall in to the crevice as it expands. You can also look at the Black Sea to see that both sides of the Black Sea actually connect beautifully. So when you pull back the ocean and you essentially singe it up, like if it was a cut in your arm, if it was cut in your upper arm, and you do the old Rambo stitching, one side's going to match the other side, right? So if you stitch the Black Sea together, you actually have this amazing correlation between all the bumps on the left and the bumps on the right. And they've done it to the moon, and they've done it to a bunch of the celestial bodies that we supposedly have pictures of. In fact, it is probably the best evidence that NASA's ever taken pictures of outside moons of planets, because you can run this expanding Earth reverse engineering theory on a lot of the surfaces, and all of a sudden it makes sense. But look up Neil Adams, look up his QuickTimes on his website. He had it all up there for free, then he started charging money, and I believe he now has it back for free again, because I don't think anybody wants to pay money to see this stuff. But on YouTube, very simple, type in expanding Earth, you're going to see a big picture of Earth. He's going to narrate, it's about 3.5 minutes long, and he just runs a computer simulation, and he's going to use the word subduction. He's going to say, notice there's no subduction, and that doesn't make sense to most of us at first, but what he means is he's not reshaping the continents much. I mean, he's just tiny, infinitesimal, where little islands kind of popped off, but he's saying, look, I kept Australia the shape of Australia, I kept, Africa and India and South America, North America, all the same shape, and they connect on all sides. So we essentially have an Earth in the prehistoric dinosaur era, which is about a fourth the size that we have today. And that's beautiful, because a fourth the size of the Earth means essentially a fourth of the gravity that we have today, thus allowing dinosaurs to be massive, insects to be massive. The atmosphere could also be extremely dense, allowing big giant, dragonflies that are 3 feet wide, right? I covered some of this in the evolution thing, but since we're sort of on planetary stuff, I thought I'd throw that in there. But we have to, and I wanted to throw that out for one specific reason, in that we're teaching our kids crap science, and we don't seem to care, So I don't know what's more. Well, I think I do. I think that someone might argue, hey, it's more inspiring to my child to believe we went to the moon, and I've got a 12-year-old, prodigy child that I mentor, and she's a genius. But when I told her that we didn't go to the moon, she got more excited that she could be the first, that there's science that's missing that needs to be discovered in order to get there, and that she knows that if her 2 feet step on the moon, she's the first one to be there potentially, right? So I think that this idea that we're somehow losing out if we don't lie to our kids, I think is bullshit. And again, the last thing you want as a parent to a child is that you're a big liar. And unfortunately, we have a lot of holidays that make us liars to our kids in the end. It's really weird. And maybe that preps them for life, because definitely as we try to learn the rules that rule us, we know that we're being lied to constantly. But anyway, this is at least the first take on the moon. There's one thing I'd like to do, but we don't quite have the feedback to pull it off, which is I'd like to do an episode where I respond to questions of all the deep thoughts and even some stuff we haven't talked about. Now, if you give me a really good question that's based on something I haven't talked about, what I might end up doing is create a complete deep thought about that one subject. So don't be bashful. Say, man, you should do one on this. Just keep in mind that I need to do an hour, right? I need to do 1 hour. So some people tell me, let's do one on GMO, and it's really tough to sit there and talk about it for 1 hour, right? It's probably about a 20 to 30-minute conversation. It's so black and white and deadly that, it's just that long. So... But again, what I'd like to do is, if you have other theories about the moon, what it'd be nice to do is I'd like to, or about how that's not a hoax, or you've got some evidence here or there. I'm always answering questions to friends who have friends that are trying to tell them that we did go, and again, it's the same old dried up questions about this stuff. One of the big ones that I didn't mention was that supposedly we left a reflector on the moon's surface, and the universities around the world since the moon missions have hit this reflector with a laser, and it bounces back to Earth. We need to know that prior to that reflector being on the moon, the same experiments were being run on the moon, because the moon is very reflective. But there is a definite landscape that has to be in a certain junction. It takes colleges nearly a month to find the reflector, just so you know, and they're told exactly where it is, right? What they're probably doing is finding a landscape where if you hit it at a certain time of day and a certain time of the year, it actually bounces directly back to the source. So all you're searching for is a natural anomaly on the surface of the Earth that actually reflects back to the moon. Again, they ran this experiment before the moon and got a bounce back, okay? So you don't need the reflector to pull it off, just so you know. So a lot of people try to throw that one out there, and it's not a piece of evidence to do anything, right? But again, I'd like to harvest your questions and create a part 2 that's just answering your questions. I don't want to muddy up the charter of the Deep Thoughts, so I might create a slightly different name, maybe Deep Thoughts Responses or something like that, episode 1, so you can kind of, if you just want the news stuff, you can stay in the news channel, that kind of stuff. But anyway, if you made it this far, man, oh man, thanks for listening. Again, our viewership is through the roof now compared to where it was. Our website is getting a tremendous amount of traffic at mkultraradio.com. And again, we have a talk show with Kyle and myself where we get into politics and all kinds of crazy stuff. And it's turned into more of a current affair show because we've covered most of the giant topics in the past. And so Deep Thoughts, I'm going to take some of the topics that we've talked about in the past and blow them out for an hour plus. And that way you get a lot of the deep minutiae as to why we believe what we believe and sort of how it affects the man's consciousness, right? But again, from the website, you got Facebook, you have the channels separated, so you got the talk show in its separate channel, Deep Thoughts in a separate channel, and I no longer do them, but I have the essays, which is essentially deep thoughts that are just in audio form, and they're just folded into the normal show's episode counter. We also had a show that we used to do called Real or Bullshit, and that's where Kyle and I have a blast just throwing things at each other. Is this real? Is this bullshit? There's a lot of like Bigfoot, aliens, that kind of stuff. A lot of it, if you've watched all the Deep Thoughts, are rehashed. Again, if you haven't seen all the Deep Thoughts, but you like one of them, definitely go back, because I guarantee you, even if the title doesn't seem that sexy, there's cool stuff in there, and I always try to put a couple little, kernels in there for your mind to think a little bit differently, and hopefully free up your consciousness to get you out of the propaganda bubble and have you think for yourself. And that's my goal 100% of the time, right? If you haven't subscribed and you dig the show, please subscribe. If you like the episode, please like it. If you do like these episodes, go back and like them all, because that helps the organic search inside YouTube. Not only does the count of views help, but the likes help. This is what I'm getting counseled by individuals that have really mega channels, and they're like, dude, you need to say this, you need to do this. If I didn't say this, people wouldn't do it. So there you go. They also challenge the users. Well, if you have any, what are your thoughts? And put your thoughts at the bottom. It's like, whatever. If you guys have a comment, I'm sure you'll type something down there. But anyway, if you made this far, thanks for listening. As we always say, learn the rules that rule you. You're following them anyway. You might as well know them. And let's put the mind back in mind control. Over and out.